Welcome to Intangibles, a podcast about the traits, behaviors, and qualities that entrepreneurs can cultivate to help be successful. This podcast is created by Antecedent Ventures, an enterprise-focused seed-stage venture firm in New York City. You can find us at www.antecedent.vc. I'm your host, Steve BERG. This season is brought to you by Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. Today's discussion is not on a specific intangible quality. Rather, it is what I would describe as a companion topic for most of the other episodes. The focus of the discussion will be measurement, specifically how to measure any intangible quality that a founder might possess. It is an attempt to make the intangible a little more tangible. Of course, the first thing one has to do is recognize the existence of qualities that drive success within the makeup of a founder's character. But once we know that certain qualities are present, we need to start to understand the degree to which these qualities exist. We can only do this when we come up with some way to measure them. There are many quotes about measurement that encapsulate this sentiment, but Ben Bernanke put it best when he said, "In many spheres of human endeavor, from science to business to education to economic policy, good decisions depend on good measurement." My guest today is Douglas Hubbard. The reason I'm so interested in speaking with him is because he wrote a book entitled How to Measure Anything, Finding the Value of Intangibles in Business. I don't know if I could have asked for a better subject matter expert for this particular topic. He's also the founder of Hubbard Decision Research, HDR, a consultancy that applies quantitative analysis methods to the most difficult measurements and challenging decisions in business. Welcome, Mr. Hubbard. Great to be able to talk to you.
Thanks for having me, Steve.
Before we begin, is there anything I left out of your bio that you'd like to highlight?
Well, I've written 3 other books and a lot of articles. I wouldn't expect you to list them all, but my most recent book was How to Measure Anything in Cybersecurity Risk. So we like to tackle some of the most difficult measurement problems of the time, and we'll be doing a whole series of How to Measure Anything books and different topics.
In my mind, that's particularly interesting. About a third of my investment portfolio is in cybersecurity, so that's actually the next book on my list. Tell me a little bit about how you decided to start HDR.
Yeah, sure. I was in management consulting prior to this. I'd started out with Coopers & Lybrand 30 years ago in their management consulting services. That's when it was a big 8. And no one cared about consulting and audit being in the same firm. This is pre-Enron and all of that. And I just ran into quite a few situations where a client thought that something wasn't measurable. And at first, as a brand new MBA, I would sort of take their word for it. I was the guy that was doing quantitative modeling methods more often than not at Coopers & Lybrand. I just found a lot of situations where somebody thought something was immeasurable that in some cases, I knew we had measured that same thing at a previous client, like customer satisfaction or technology risk or project risk. So eventually, I began to become more suspicious of the claim that something wasn't measurable. And that's why almost 20 years ago, I founded Hubbard Decision Research.
Yeah, I think the other thing about that is you probably could tell the opportunity by the value of those things that weren't being measured, at least it seems to me. What kind of companies engage Hubbard Decision Research?
Well, it's a pretty wide variety. You can imagine really any kind of organization where they have complex decisions with lots of uncertainties and difficult measurements. So we've done work for big pharma, for big oil and gas, for mining operations, lots of federal agencies, civilian and military, lots of big not-for-profits like the United Nations, et cetera. So really, mostly it's Fortune 500 and then sometimes smaller firms, sometimes startups, and various government agencies, both foreign and domestic.
I'm not surprised. And an engagement lasts, what, a month or a couple of months, or is it shorter than that?
2 weeks to a year.
2 weeks to a year.
A wider range.
To a year. Wow. When one writes a book entitled How to Measure Anything, I'm sure there's going to be a lot of people who want to put that to the test. What are some of the more interesting things that companies have hired you to help measure?
Oh, sure. And some of these you can find just by Googling us. But we've done 2 projects for the United Nations. One was for measuring the economic impact and sustainability of restoring the Kabuchi Desert in Inner Mongolia. And one was for prioritizing infrastructure investments in Haiti, or should you invest in schools or roads first, et cetera. But we've also done things like measuring drought resilience in the Horn of Africa, or forecasted fuel requirements for the Marine Corps on the battlefield, or even forecasting how much money new movies will make. We've done market analysis and demand analysis for new medical devices and laboratory equipment, artificial organs, and even worked out the value of better prioritization of organ donor recipients.
Yeah. I was expecting a kind of a eclectic list, and certainly that is. Some of those do sound like they may be absolutely impossible to measure, but clearly not. The second part of the title is Finding the Value of Intangibles in Business. But it sounds to me like you're saying that if one can measure something, even if it's difficult, then it really actually isn't intangible. So am I going to have to change the name of the podcast after our discussion today?
Well, you'll notice that on the title, I actually put the word intangible in quotes.
Yeah.
Now, in a strict sense, lots of things are intangible that we routinely measure. If you mean not physically touchable, well, we measure time, and we measure things like the value of an object. People see prices on eBay. Those are measurable things, but even price, which businesses think about all the time, isn't technically tangible. So if what they mean by intangible, we take it in the other sense, the more common sense that people use the term intangible, which is they don't think it can be measured. And in that sense, yes, you may have intangibles in business, but that doesn't mean they're immeasurable. So there may be things that are abstractions, like economic value or the price of an object is a kind of abstraction, right? You're moving some points from one person's register to another person's register that represents future consumption or wealth building ability, right? That's all that really means. Depreciation on a physical asset, that's not a thing you directly observe, at least not accounting style appreciation. You can observe physical deterioration, but not book depreciation. So people are routinely adding up and subtracting and multiplying things that aren't physically tangible, right? But they are measurable. And this includes everything that a VC might run into in terms of evaluating new opportunities. They certainly are measurable.
So it sounds like I might be getting off on a technicality, which is great because I think it would be really difficult to change all the marketing. All right. So there are, I know, many techniques, having read the book, to measure many different things. But there are 2 specific focus areas I want to target with you today. Those are small business metrics and, not surprisingly, founder skills and ability. For the small business metrics part, my impression from the book is that Fermi and confidence intervals are important techniques, maybe the most important techniques for that particular set of metrics. I've got 4 questions for you. First of all, do I have that right? Are those the 2 that you would put kind of as the best way for measuring small business metrics?
Yes, certainly. When you refer to Fermi, we're talking about Enrico Fermi and how his name was associated with decomposing difficult estimates, right? So if you're trying to figure out what your demand might be for a particular market, you're opening up a bakery in an area, and you try to figure out, well, what would my monthly demand be? Well, you might start with, well, what's the population of the area? How often would they visit a store like mine? what percentage of the population would, frequent a bakery, and how often would someone who comes to a bakery come again, and what would be the typical transaction size per visit. That would be a decomposition. Generally, and there's been research on this, but generally, if you can break down highly uncertain things in a few basic variables like this, generally your estimate improves. Your estimate becomes more accurate in terms of the forecast. So that's a Fermi decomposition. And the confidence intervals, specifically the subjective confidence intervals, those are a good measure of how much you know now. So if you say, well, I don't know what percentage of the population would actually visit my bakery, but I believe it's somewhere between 5% and 20% of the households would eventually visit my bakery sometime over the next quarter. That would be a representation of your current state of uncertainty. Now, maybe you would have said 10 to 15% and had a much narrower estimate, a very accurate estimate. That would be hard to imagine that a small business just starting out would have that much certainty. More likely, it would be something like 1% to 30%. It'd be a very wide range. So yeah, that's the confidence intervals are important. I would actually introduce another concept. There's three things that I call measurement maxims in the book. And well, the first three of the measurement maxims are: assume it's been measured before. No matter what you're measuring in a small business, just assume it's been measured before and try to do some research to find out who measured it, how they measured something, or if they measured something similar, what techniques did they use? Because there's a good chance that that will turn out to be true. A lot of people start measurements assuming that they're the first people on the planet in the history of the world ever to try to measure that thing. And if you do a little bit of research, you find out that that's rarely true. You may win a Nobel Prize someday for measuring something that's never been measured before, but chances are you won't. You'll measure something that's really pretty routine in some industry. Secondly, we remind people that there's probably more data than they think. They probably have more data than they think. They often think they don't have enough data to measure something. But if you're resourceful, how do you have more data? If a bakery's starting up in this small town, how do they have more data than they think? Well, does the Chamber of Commerce have something? Does the Department of Commerce at the federal level, does it have data about the failure rates of bakeries? Did somebody write their PhD dissertation within the last 5 years about the success rates of bakeries in small towns? You don't know until you look, right? And finally, the third one was, or the third of the measurement maxims was, you probably need less data than you think. A lot of people do a lot of hand-wringing about, I'm not sure I have enough data. But when we actually do the math, people are often surprised by what kind of inferences they can make from apparently small amounts of data. If you have a lot of uncertainty, a few data points will greatly reduce that uncertainty.
Yeah, the other thing that strikes me is that oftentimes people also think they need complete data, when incomplete data will suffice to get you, maybe not all the way there, but at least closer.
Oh, sure. Yeah. Well, the simple example I come up with is when physicists measured the speed of light, they didn't actually measure all the photons, right?
Right.
They measured a sample of them. And if somebody says, well, those are much more uniform, I say, well, look at when we measure things like income levels. They don't actually survey everybody every month, right? Mm-hmm. Or unemployment levels. They don't survey everybody every month. They sample thousands of people, but it's usually a subset. They attempt a random subset. But that's how most science works. Most science is based on randomized samples of much larger populations. And if we do the math right, it turns out we can make all kinds of inferences from small samples of large populations. As counterintuitive as that is to some people, that is true.
So the good news is, of the 4 questions I had, I don't have to ask you question number 2 and number 3 because you've already answered it. The better news is that I can substitute in one of my own questions that I didn't actually write down. And that has to do a little bit with Fermi. And my recollection is that, Your typical business student, when they're attacking a problem, will attack it in a very straightforward process way, and they may immediately come to the conclusion that they've run into some kind of a wall that they just can't solve. But Fermi in particular was particularly good at looking at the entire situation and figuring out that there's kind of more than one way to skin a cat to improve it, and that you can actually kind of help certain people start to frame things differently and think about things differently so that they can get to a Fermi analysis. And by the way, that ends up resulting in, that situation we talked about where, okay, not complete information or not completely correct, but significantly closer to correct than we had been prior.
I mean, if the objective is to reduce your uncertainty, Voltaire said perfect is the enemy of the good, right?
Yeah.
So some people say, well, I'm highly uncertain, but unless I can get this ideal amount of information, I've effectively learned nothing. That is not true. Mathematics shows that uncertainty reduction, statistics, is incremental. Every few observations allow us to reduce our uncertainty a little bit. Enrico Fermi, just for context for people, he was a Nobel Prize-winning physicist and he worked on the Manhattan Project. And so back in the early 20th century, when he was teaching his engineering and science students how to estimate uncertain things as part of his class, this is one of the reasons he was an entertaining professor, he would ask them whimsical things like estimate how many piano tuners are in the city of Chicago.
Ah, yes.
And at first, his engineering and science students, which I assume are all very smart people ending up in Enrico Fermi's class, right, would feel stumped. They would say, how could I possibly know that? Because they're thinking like engineers. They're thinking, unless I have all the data, I know nothing. Well, Enrico Fermi says, well, instead of focusing on what we don't know, let's see what we can infer from what we do know or can get, okay? What's the population of the city? What's the average number of people per household? What percentage of households have pianos? How often does a piano have to be tuned? How many pianos can a piano tuner tune in a day given travel times between pianos, etc.? And often they'd come up with a range, let's say they'd come up with a range like 40 to 130. And, each student would have their own range like this. And then they would look up some list like Yellow Pages back in those days, or even before Yellow Pages, Guild List, because they're guilds for piano tuners. And they'd find out that the answer was 48 or something, right? Well, the students would be surprised that what they thought they could literally know nothing about, they could make some inferences about. They could put some constraints on their uncertainty based on other things they do know. There's a quote from a Malcolm Gladwell book, Outliers, where I'm paraphrasing a bit, but it's something to the effect that a successful person is someone who spends 20 minutes trying to figure something out that most people give up on immediately. And this is what I see with immeasurables a lot. It's not that someone actually thought about it for 20 minutes and then, out of frustration gave up. They usually very quickly label it as immeasurable or intangible and then don't think about it further. So, yeah, a little effort goes a long ways.
So because of the fact that I deal with engineers pretty much all the time, I think you just right now in that answer unlocked a new world for them. You probably also answered the fourth question, but I'm going to ask it anyway, just in case there's something you didn't touch on. And that final question about small business metrics is, how can these particular techniques be valuable to early stage companies in particular?
Right. Well, first off, I think a lot of the research tells us that there's room for humility in decision making and estimation. We should always be skeptical to a certain degree. And this is a little bit of the dilemma for the early entrepreneur, because entrepreneurs by definition are optimistic, visionary people, et cetera, and they have to often fight against the odds. Something may be unlikely, and they're still going to succeed. And a lot of them will fail, but they're going to try it anyway. So maybe they're optimistic, maybe over-optimistic. But there is room for skepticism for the purpose of improving our own decision-making. A lot of research has been done comparing human decision-making in a huge variety of fields to relatively simple statistical models. And the statistical models frequently outperform the human experts in a surprising variety of problems. The prognosis of diseases, recidivism of criminals, who's going to do better in medical school, the failure rates of small businesses. That was actually one. Which sales people are going to be better salespeople, et cetera. In all of these areas, someone who thought that this was a uniquely human endeavor to make a decision about this, that there's no way that an equation could improve on my decades of experience, it turns out that that's wrong. It turns out that the relatively simple statistical models are beating the human experts.
I'm going to chuck in one, but I'm not going to take credit for it because it's actually something that you mentioned to me the other day. And that is that sometimes what is seemingly a small incremental amount can have a large impact based on kind of the law of large dollars. So for example, the ability to reduce fraud by 0.5% or 0.75%, that market change could be in the hundreds of millions or even billions of dollars to the company that's doing it. So what I learned from you the other day was that you should really think about the actual impact of the things that you're measuring relative to how you run your business. We touched on this a little bit, but I just want to make sure you get a chance to more fully answer the question. Newer companies in general, they tend to have fewer data points, right? They tend to have less information about the length of their sales cycle, less information about the skills required for the new sales hires, for how long it's going to take to hire somebody to fill a role. The fact that there's fewer data points actually make accurate measurement difficult. How would you recommend that startups kind of tackle this challenge of fewer data points when making decisions?
Yeah, well, first, I'll make 2 points here. One is to circle back to the point I just made about you don't have to have any data points to interpolate from your large heterogeneous set of history of experience, right? So just like you and I have no data points of when we die, right? And yet someone can still compute a life insurance premium for us. So yeah, in that second measurement maxim, I said you have more data than you think.
Right.
And the way that you have more than a few data points is that there's lots of other people that all claim to be unique in the approach that they're taking, that all have been gathering data points. What's the typical growth rate and failure rate for businesses that start up in your area? Find that out.
Right. Yep. This is the muscle memory that venture capitalists often talk about.
The second point on that one I was going to make is that when we talk about the venture capitalists having muscle memory, remember that their use of intuition in no way alleviates the problem of a startup having a few data points. What are they actually basing their judgments on then? Aren't they basing their judgments on experience with other unique venture capital startups?
They are.
So the question is not whether or not you can make decisions in these situations. The question is only which methodology measurably outperforms the other. And the data so far from a wide variety of studies indicates that statistical models are outperforming the human experts.
So I'm going to dig into this a little bit. I was kind of saving this for later, but now is the right time. The other day when we were talking and you said, well, everybody knows that a subjective interview and reference checks is the worst way to determine if someone is actually qualified for a job. And I said, Well, secretly thinking to myself, oh, hell, that's exactly the way I and many other VCs do it. So let's talk about that a little bit more. Just in general about the notion of why that's worst, and a little bit more about some of the things that we should incorporate into that decision process.
Yeah, there's some research on this that, things like general aptitude tests are actually better predictors of job performance. This is different than a startup, of course, but when you're talking about hiring people for job performance, aptitude tests tend to be better predictors, and especially aptitude tests that may be geared specifically for that kind of job, right? Like if you're the aptitude test for an accountant versus a warehouse worker versus an engineer, those may be very different aptitude tests. But still, structured tests like that seem to be better predictors of future performance. Structured interviews seem to be better, good predictors of future performance. That is, you're asking a series of questions and the interviewer can grade individual responses.
Yeah, there actually is a right answer.
Yeah, they can say, how quickly did the person respond to this question? What is their posture, et cetera, when they respond to this question? So you're actually recording very specific details, and you're not relying on the memory of the researcher or the researcher's own unstructured note-taking capabilities, right? Or the interviewer's own unstructured note-taking capabilities to make the decisions. The fact is, those free-form kinds of interviews that people tend to have, those are more easily influenced by a wide variety of external factors that have nothing to do with your decision. Did you have your coffee yet? How long was your commute? Did you get a good night's sleep? These are things that actually affect decision making much more than I think a lot of decision makers would be willing to accept. So your risk aversion and your level of optimism and your ability to estimate things actually changes daily for reasons you're not consciously aware of. And so these are some sources of noise in the decision-making process that VCs need to be aware of. That sometimes you made the decision you made because for reasons you're not aware of, you were just more risk averse on Tuesday morning than you were Thursday afternoon. And that's it.
Sure.
So the fact is we have to be aware of the sorts of things that inadvertently influence our estimates and decisions. And when we start to control for those factors, and there are ways to control for them, then our decisions improve.
Yeah. So, from my takeaway as a venture capitalist is, yes, I have to do my best at understanding my biases. I have to build in mechanisms for eliminating those biases. And that I think, I have to, even after the fact, take into consideration the fact that there still might be biases in the decision. All difficult things. Okay, so started to touch on it, decided to spend a little bit more time on the business metrics. We're switching over to founder skills and abilities. And I think this is where it gets a little bit tougher. In VC, there's a couple rules of thumb that many investors treat as dogma. For example, bet on the jockey, not the horse. That's an axiom. And the meaning being invest in the founder more so than the idea. Similarly, you'll often hear people say, the founder accounts for 80% of the success of a startup. And that might be true. Maybe it's not true. But I don't think that there's ever been a study to determining just exactly what percent of the success the founder accounts for. How would you go about measuring the value of a founder to the overall success of a company?
Well, the first thing I would do, and this is true for all of our research and any scientific research, which is I start with secondary research. I start with who's already measured this. Now, I used to, if you go back even just 10 or 15 years ago, I used to go to a library more often. I don't really have to do that anymore. We go to Google Scholar, or if you have access to library resources like JSTOR online, those are useful research methods. And you can find that there's probably somebody who's measured something like this. Are there specific attributes of founders that have come up more often? You mentioned, Angela Duckworth at one point.
Yes, grits.
Now, yes. And so did she find, this would be something to dive into the specifics of, did she find that specific attributes that she associated with what she called grit, did they actually correlate with the likelihood of success? Okay, so start with the axiom that it's probably been measured before. So start with that and see what is out there. Secondly, remember, you probably have more data than you think, right? Yep. So it's not just that founder that you're evaluating. You're evaluating your whole decision-making process, your whole estimation process, even how well you remember anecdotes historically. So think about the performance of your decision-making method itself. Because you know what the most important decision that a VC makes? The single most important decision is how they make decisions. That's the thing that you're evaluating first, your decision-making method, okay? Mm-hmm. So if you do find research that says that, here's a specific list of observable things, characteristics of a founder that correlate well with outcomes, the next question is, well, do I have some additional data that I'm not thinking of immediately? Can I think about this a little bit longer and get resourceful about the kind of data that might be available to me? Are there structured surveys I can give founders? Can I start providing these structured surveys to a larger set of individuals? Because presumably if you're VC, you're talking to a lot of startups, right?
Absolutely.
So you can start tracking your own data more systematically. That's a straightforward answer by itself. And then don't be afraid to actually do the math. I mean, simple statistics with the data that you're gathering. And don't assume that you need X amount to be statistically significant, because that's a widely misunderstood concept.
A little more granular, although I know you've given a lot of detail on this. How would I go about deciding which intangible qualities actually might have the most impact on success?
Well, I guess that comes back to what I mentioned earlier, is I would start with, just like I've done for any other client in any other field, start with that secondary research. Just think in terms of different measurement methods and different decision-making methods themselves have a return on investment. Just a corollary to the most important decision is how you make decisions. The most important investment VCs are going to make is an investment in their decision-making methods. That's going to be the highest return in your portfolio, is just an improvement in decision-making methods themselves. If you evaluate, let's say, scores or maybe hundreds of startups a year, however big a VC firm might be, and you make bets on a handful or maybe a few dozen of them a year, and you get failures and successes, et cetera. Think about what it would be worth if you had 5 or 10% less error. By that, I mean you're 5 or 10% less likely to approve someone who's a bad bet, to invest in someone who's a bad bet, or not invest in someone who would have been a good bet, right? What's it worth for a small error reduction? And when you do the math on that, you find out that a huge return is associated with just improving your decision-making process itself. The best way to spend 1% of your VC portfolio is to optimize the other 99%, to figure out how to make decisions about the allocation of the other 99%. Does that make sense?
It does make sense. So I'm going to, based on that answer and some of the things that you've told me earlier in this discussion, it seems like, I'm paraphrasing, that the best method for measuring founder skills and abilities is this thing called the Likert Scale. And I'm going to ask you to explain that in a second. But if you put that in conjunction with multiple choice, rank order, open-ended questions. So give me a little bit of high level on that. And I'm going to ask you for the other side of the coin in a second. But let me start with a little high level on that.
Yeah, I'm actually, so for individuals who might not be familiar with it, the Likert Scale is, the scale you've seen before in surveys probably, where you strongly agree or strongly disagree. It's usually a 7-point scale or something to that effect.
Yep.
Someone makes a claim, the president is doing a good job, strongly agree, strongly disagree, that sort of thing. That's a Likert scale. And you might have seen a Likert scale with, I am satisfied with this product, strongly agree, strongly disagree, 7-point scale. I generally actually try to avoid scales like that, subjective scales like that. I try to, where possible, look at specific observable outcomes where they're objective, right? Like, for example, how long did it take the interviewee to respond to a question? Seconds, right? that's at least objective. It has the ability. It has less of a problem with being influenced by whether or not you are a strong grader, a tough grader or an easy grader, right? Those are just objective outcomes. Now, that doesn't mean that Likert scales never correlate with observable outcomes. So just remember that when you're using Likert scales, you've got a two-sided measurement instrument. You've got the scale itself and the person using the scale. So you're actually measuring the performance of the person using the scale. And you might have, one person in your VC firm sitting down talking to a founder and another person talking to a different founder, but they just score things differently. And so in a way, you might just be evaluating the skills of those, interviewers interviewing those founders, right? So that's as opposed to saying, things like yes or no, was there a financial projection for demand in their business plan? How many, what degree does the founder have? How long has the founder been working on this idea? How many other VCs has the founder already talked to and been turned down, right? So those may seem like, well, they're not all entirely indicative of chance of success, but they're much more objective, right? And I would like to test to see how well they correlate with observed outcomes. If somebody says, well, that's not going to tell me anything, I say, I don't know that. Prove it.
So this is good because, in reading it, I thought to myself that, a Likert scale can be objective, can have specific observable outcomes. But you're really saying, no, that's really for trying to get your hands around subjective things. If we're doing our work in terms of finding the right employee or making choices about intangibles, what we really need is much more of a kind of a multiple choice, a rank order, stay away from open-ended questions, things that are, frankly measurable.
Yeah, and I'm happy to test, hypotheses along those lines. Maybe Likert scales are really the better answer in some cases. So I'm fine with, seeing what the objective data says about those things. My tendency is whenever I come up with a scale or feel I have to use a Likert scale, I always feel like I'm giving up too soon.
So I'm going to hop to the last section that I want to discuss with you, and I'd like to do a little exercise. If this is proprietary in terms of what you do, then feel free to tell me no. But let's say I wanted to try to measure, for example, the ability to motivate employees. If I were an HDR client, what process would you put me through to detect and measure what I'm calling an intangible, but I doubt you would actually call it that?
Yeah, sure. Well, first off, it's not proprietary in the sense that, I think other people have done this. I've certainly been inspired by others. And it's fairly well laid out in my book, but I do believe we bring some skill to the table at doing this. So I'll take a shot at this.
Excellent.
I would ask somebody first. Now, let me treat you as the subject here.
Oh boy, here we go.
Okay. So, great. Sounds like an interesting skill. Have you seen variations in ability to motivate?
Absolutely.
Okay. So it must have observables that you've based this on then. So when you saw variations in ability to motivate, what did you see?
Well, it was mostly based on outcomes that I saw, but I did see that there were multiple approaches from managers trying to motivate the people that worked for them.
Okay. So you tried different approaches, and you thought that some approaches were more indicative of ability to motivate than other approaches.
I believe that's the case because some of the outcomes were better based on everything else being equal.
Great. So what you really were measuring this whole time was outcomes.
Perhaps I was observing outcomes and I still don't have a way to measure them.
Great. So we've switched gears a little bit, which is good. We're evolving the question. The question itself is evolving a little bit. We found out that the original question of how do I measure ability to motivate, when we break it down, often turns into other things, right?
Yep.
That we find out that that is an ambiguous umbrella term for probably a lot of very specific things, and we should unpack those things, right?
Right.
So that's why the first question I often ask are things like, what do you mean and what do you see when you see more of it? If you focus on those kinds of questions, in other words, if we focus on the observable consequences of the thing that you're trying to measure, then you're halfway to measuring it. The rest is trivial math, right? The rest is just your data gathering procedures and how you make inferences, et cetera. So the question is what do we observe? Now, the reason people might think that would be important to measure is because they believe from their historical observations, remember just their experience, but with selective recall and so forth, from their historical observations, they believe they've observed variations in this thing. And they believe they've observed, or can at least imagine, how variations in ability to motivate correlates with outcomes. So here's some things that we could measure. Now, the other thing that we always have to remember to do, though, is just assume someone's measured it before, right?
Yes.
If we went to a library research database for a local university library, or just went to Google Scholar, and you said measuring ability to motivate, what do you think would come up? I might have to try a few other search phrases to zero in on something, but I highly doubt this has never been measured before, right? So if we did that, we'd often be inspired by the methods that people have come up with over time. So if what we mean by ability to motivate is I've observed things that people do, and based on those observed things that managers tend to do, I observe differences in outcomes and in observed performance outcomes of the individuals, I would say, okay, let's test that hypothesis. Have you observed variations in performance, or has somebody else observed this? Remember, you have more data than you think. There's people have been measuring things like this for a long time. Are there things that correlate with improvements in performance? Have people done surveys of employees in the past and with other studies that said, what are the characteristics of your boss, your manager? And then they observe that there's correlations between employees' perceptions of their manager and improved performance, right?
Yes.
Certainly, I think there's some low-hanging fruit here, that there's certainly some negative things that I would associate with reduced performance. That, our manager does not inspire trust. Maybe as a Likert scale, that's useful, right? Because if you're using a Likert scale to survey a large number of people, then the variations in individual use of that Likert scale, like by a decision maker, are less of an issue. So let's maybe just for this one, we'll use a Likert scale. I'm not a fan of using Likert scales for individual one-off decision makers, because then you've got that person's use of the scale as a primary consideration in the variation of it. But if you're asking lots of people, like lots of employees in lots of companies, then those kinds of variations average out a little bit. So let's ask questions like, do you agree or disagree? Strongly agree or strongly disagree? Does your manager inspire trust? Does your manager inspire you to work harder? Does your manager allow you to make suggestions? Do you believe that your suggestions are taken seriously by your manager, et cetera? You can imagine a bunch of questions like this, and I bet somebody has already done research on things exactly like that, right?
Yes. And the thing about what you're saying is this just requires thinking, right? It just requires like taking a moment and translating these observations into actions, specific observable outcomes.
Yes, exactly. And don't be, too intimidated by any statistics after this, because that's actually the trivial part.
Right. And what I'm also interpreting from your answer is that this process that you just laid out for ability to motivate employees, it's transferable to just about any quality.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it comes to how do we even think we know what we think we know? Why do I think I know this thing? Why do I think I've seen people that are charismatic? Why do I think I've seen better cases of motivation or negative motivation, et cetera? What did I observe?
Well, this is amazingly helpful. We're going to close here, but before I do, is there anything else that I really should have asked about that you'd like to add in particular? Anything I omitted?
Oh, well, let's see. I think this is a really important field, how VCs actually make decisions about founders. And some VCs are succeeding. And even for those that are successful, you still have to ask the question, was I good or was I lucky? Right?
Yep.
Even if we had a giant coin flipping contest, somebody's going to be the champion coin flipper, right? That doesn't mean anything about skill. So even for VCs, we have to ask, well, how many VCs are there? And are there statistically more VCs that are successful than random chance would account for if it was just a coin flipping contest of which founders to bet on, et cetera? Mm-hmm. So we can ask the tough questions of ourselves.
Okay, so want to conclude, where can our listeners or potential clients, for that matter, where can they find you?
Well, I do show up in Google if you Google my name. Also my book, How to Measure Anything, but you can go straight to our website, hubbardresearch.com. And my books have a website too under howtomeasureanything.com. So different books have different pages there that you can go to. And my books often encourage the readers to go to downloadable Excel files to help them with certain kinds of problems. And so we take people to spreadsheets that show them how to do a controlled experiment or estimate the mean of a population based on a small random sample, or et cetera, et cetera. There's a few other methods there. We just sort of did the math in advance for them and just said, here's a spreadsheet. Now, there's no reason you shouldn't just be doing this, because you can just copy the data here and read the answer there. So you don't have to know the math.
Which, by the way, those are great. I highly recommend people going to check that resource out. It's really great of you to put that out there. All right, Mr. Hubbard, let's end here. Thank you very much for your time and your informed insight. I'm a huge fan of process, so this discussion has been right up my alley. It's been great.
All right, thanks. Great pleasure talking to you and your listeners.
This has been Intangibles, a podcast created by Antecedent Ventures. Find out more at www.antecedent.vc. I'd like to thank Denton's Venture Technology Group at dentonsventurebeyond.com for being the sponsor this season and a supportive partner. Operating as a boutique within the world's largest law firm, the Venture Technology Group runs with hard-charging tech entrepreneurs to drive growth through strategic business, finance, and legal advice, from Silicon Valley and New York to London, Berlin, Hong Kong, and beyond. Learn more at dentonsventurebeyond.com. I'd also like to thank Ben Glawi, who's been instrumental in helping me record and produce this season. I couldn't have done it without him. Find him on Twitter at visible_sound. And thank you. Keep an eye out for the next episode, and if you like this one, leave us a favorable review. I'm your host, Steve BERG.